Hey everybody. Everyone hear me okay? I think that's going to be a little hard to follow up 30 under 30, so I'll give slightly a different talk here. I'm going to talk a bit more just about my general experience in Lab2Market and be maybe a bit more coy about where we're going right now, but I think my experience might be helpful for some people who are more on the fence about something like entrepreneurship, and this is kind of the perspective that I'm coming to it from. So my talk, my short 50 minutes here is going to be about a tale of two theses, and the reason there's two theses is because it was myself and another PhD student from my research group who actually got into this program for two different projects themselves. To start, I should give you a quick background on who I am. So I started with an undergrad in biology as well as a diploma in biotech, and then was managing a research group that I haphazardly fell into over the course of a couple years, where I started as a volunteer in a group and then eventually became manager like 4 years later. So it was a good time. Learned a lot about the academic funding systems, about grant writing, about managing projects, and this was a device development lab geared towards neurosurgical devices. So learned a lot about the whole ecosystem around how do you develop something that's going to go into a human at some point, and in the neurosurgical space. So very interesting, very neat. Learned a lot of the inside of it, and around the same time, I was also working on research projects here and there. At some point, my professor was like, hey, why don't you do a master's? You're already doing some research work, so convinced me to do the Master's of Applied Science and Biomedical Engineering program, so I started doing that, managing the lab part-time. And during this whole course of it, I met another, oh, that's supposed to go the other way. There we go. I met another research student. His name is Yuta Dobashi, pictured here, being all sciencey and cool and smart, because he is one of the smartest people I've met. I managed to meet him when he was doing his master's at UBC. He was working on a hydrogel material, which had a piezoelectric effect, some very cool publications in science. And we worked virtually together. I convinced him, hey, you're interested in more medical side of things. What about if you joined our lab for your PhD? Managed to convince him to move to Toronto, started his PhD, and was working on a embolic hydrogel. So really interesting technology, and really, mirrored me very well in that we are very opposite people. Yuta's a bit more of an introvert, much more grounded in his work. I am a little bit extroverted, let's say. Either way, so you should get a bit of an understanding of the technology that we had. And so what I was working on in my master's project was this thing that you can see here. Essentially what it is a fiber Bragg grating that was used in order to pick up pulse wave deformations in a blood vessel. What you can tell is whether, or essentially you can look at vascular health. It's a alternative measure of how well someone's vascular system is doing. Could tell you something about cardiac disease. There's a lot of potential as a new method and a more quantifiable method for diagnosing cardiovascular disorders, something that right now you're using blood tests and something like a blood pressure cuff. But that's only really giving you so much information, and it's not necessarily very standardized. So there was a lot of potential with this, and I was working very much on the R&D side of this. So I had come up with a way to actually put this elastomer together, and you can see it there on my wrist, and as you can tell, very high tech, being held together by a rubber band. Comparatively, Yuta's work was on this hydrogel for embolization, where we had a number of different vascular networks that we could treat. Essentially, what we're looking at here is oftentimes the body is going to make a mistake when it's creating new vessels, and it might create vessels where it's not supposed to, or you might have a highly vascularized nidus of vessels that you're not supposed to have, or you have something like an aneurysm. In each of these cases, you're trying to block those vessels. You want to shut down the flow to that area. And you might do this through something like an embolic, where you're going to go from the femoral artery in the leg all the way up to your brain with a catheter, and you're going to inject something in there. And what Yuta had worked on was a polymer that was able to actually go and sit in that space, stick to the tissue, and not flow downstream. Because as you can imagine, if you were to block vessels you're not supposed to block, that's generally a bad thing. So he figured out a really good method of control for this. And we were working together during the pandemic, and at some point, as I'm doing my master's, he's doing his PhD, we're both broke students while I'm, still part-time managing the lab. And I got an email about the Lab2Market program. I was like, hey, this looks like it could be cool. What if we did it? And he was like, I don't know if I want to do that. Both of us never really thought of ourselves as entrepreneurs or going into entrepreneurship. We both thought, yeah, we're academics. We are going to be broke for the rest of our lives until one of us maybe becomes a professor. And then the other one's just going to ride coattails. So, one of the things that we kind of went into this program, one of the things that looked interesting about it was, we can figure out if this is a good idea, because every academic thinks their ideas are great. Everyone's like, I have solved a problem no one else has solved, and you do have to tell your thesis committee that, so fair. But it was actually a question of, is it actually a good idea? Is it something that is going to be, useful if we were to bring it out into the world? And when has it not being a good idea ever stopped us? So, first off, is it actually a good idea? Most ideas, they're decent. You're going to come up with something, it's probably going to be useful. It might be very niche, but, what is the actual problem that you're solving? Like, is it actually solving the problem in a way that people are going to use it? And is it what people need, or is it what they want? Because you might come up with the greatest solution to something, but if it's not what the user is actually going to be willing to use, the technology will fail. This is especially true in the medical space, where you will see surgeons that are unwilling to change the current workflows because it just does not fit within their current working parameters. It's not going to be adopted otherwise. And does it fit into the context? And this is especially true for something like neurosurgery. And so we didn't know the answers to these questions. You have to go through and you have to ask the right people. And this is something that Lab2Market was forcing us to do. We had to do try to get to over 100 interviews. I don't think we got there, but we got pretty high up there, or I know I did at least. And so it's, how do you know if it's a good idea? And the one thing that I believe it was Harry had told me was like, did you get that wow? Did you say it, tell somebody a bit about what you're working on? You were asking some questions, and then at the end of it, you didn't want to bias people when you were asking the questions of just trying to understand the market itself. But at some point, you did usually tell them, well, here's what I'm working on. And the question was, did they stop and just be like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Oh my gosh, that would change everything. And it's a good question. And so we asked these questions, which led to a whole bunch of more questions. How are you going to prove it works? Where are you going to go with it? Is it scalable? What's the actual market? Who's going to be the target? Who are your KOLs? Do people actually need it? Do people actually want it? Is this something that's going to work? And both Yuta and I went and we asked these questions to numerous people. And so what did we find? Well, for me, was it a good idea? Maybe. It had potential, but nobody said, wow. Nobody was like, oh, this is solving all the problems. Everyone was like, I could see that might work. You could replace something like blood pressure, and yeah, you could get something more quantitative, but there's a long path to get there. You're going to have to do multiple clinical trials. You're going to need probably a few thousand patients at least minimum, and a lot of data over the course of many years. It's going to be a very extended timeline, but there's potential. But for Yuta got the more interesting response because there was a clear development pathway. There was clearly a need for it. There are high failure rates in the current methods for treatments of hypervascular tumors, hypervascularitis, and aneurysms. So there's an eager and willing market. There's a want to change, and every single person who was in the field gave that wow. Like, there was one point where I was giving a talk, or I was doing an interview, trying to find out from a interventional radiologist whether my tech could be used for something like monitoring during a procedure. And I mentioned offhand, oh well, one of my other friends, he's working on a project that's a liquid embolic, and he's like, oh, liquid embolic, like what kind? And I showed him just the research paper there, and he was just like, wait, you can do this? So I know that's not for my field necessarily, but we could adapt that. And he was more excited about that project than mine, which was great. Really, really inspired the confidence. So they said, wow. But, and there's always a but, what even is an entrepreneur? And I don't know if I want to do that. See, like I said, when I started this program, I was an academic, Yuta was an academic, we were both grad students, we were both like, yeah, this is where we're going. And so what comes to mind when you think of a startup? For me, it wasn't such a glamorous thing. It was sleeping under desks and pulling 90-hour work weeks, which you were already doing in academia, but I don't know, something noble about it. It was things like the show Silicon Valley. It was all of the current things that are on Apple TV and Prime and everything, describing business founders who seem a little unhinged, but interesting characters. That wasn't necessarily where I wanted to go, or wasn't necessarily the way I thought it was. And then I talked to Wes, I talked to Harry, I talked to more and more people. I met, actually one of the most interesting people I've met is this other student who was in the same cohort as me, Daniel Jaguar, and who was in synthetic biology and is one of my very good friends now, and just really changed my perspective of what I thought entrepreneurship could be. It made me realize I have to get my own biases out of my own way to better understand what's the potential here. And so working with Wes and Harry, I actually got a lot out of understanding, what could be done with this? And those two startup journeys are the same. I've heard a million different stories at this point of how different startups got started. And one of the things that I think, it was a meeting with Wes, that he was like, you can kind of build something that's going to have the values that you embody. You can make it whatever you want it to be so that you have the healthy, positive environment you're looking for. And you can have a positive impact outside of the academic realm. You can think about publishing. Yeah, you can publish and publish and publish and publish, and you might get a ton of citations, but is that necessarily going to change treatment paradigms? Are you necessarily going to change how a therapeutic works? Not necessarily. And so it didn't have to be the stereotype in my mind, and that was something Lab2Market helped me get around, was understanding that, yeah, it could be more than this. And so for the last part of this journey, I realized you also have to play to your strengths and know who you can work with. Because you see, Yuta and I, we learned a lot about ourselves in this. We learned we both really liked a lot of this entrepreneurship stuff. We liked asking those bigger questions and finding the answers to those. Is this actually a good idea? What's the timeline? How do we get it to market? How do we get people involved in it? We liked figuring out the process of how to build something new. Are we going to manufacture this in-house or go outside? Are we going to go to the FDA or Health Canada first? Where would we go with it? What type of regulatory approvals can we go through? What is the pathway? But the one place we were different, and you saw in those first two pictures, was in talking to people. I'm okay with talking to people. I kind of like it sometimes. Yuta, on the other hand, realized he was drained whenever he had to do these interviews. He was like, I really don't love this. And once Yuta gets to know you, it's great, but before that, wasn't the best experience for him. So what we realized is we could play to our strengths if we teamed up. My project seemed like it had some potential, but had a very long pathway. His had a direct one and something that we could both benefit from, and we knew that we could work together. He was stronger technically in terms of his technology, wanted to deal less with the people, the investors, and the heavy business development side. He still wanted to be a part of it, but not necessarily nearly as close to it as I would be. And I could create the environment that lets the tech flourish and I enjoyed handling the business development side of things while also still being able to contribute to the tech. I mean, some of the most fun I have is when I still get to go sit in the lab with our engineering team. And so one of the last things, and this is something that didn't necessarily come from Lab2Market, but something we learned about each other early, was that we could argue with each other. We knew how to disagree with each other in a way that neither of us walked away with hurt feelings, neither of us took anything personally. It was Yuta can very sternly and not necessarily very diplomatically be like, hey, you might be wrong about this. And I knew how to step back and be like, he might be right. Okay, let's talk through it. And we come out of it, both of us having learned a bunch of it, figured out how to move forward from there, and it's just a much stronger partnership because of it. We knew that we could work together, and I've had partnerships where I knew I couldn't work together with somebody. So this was something that was foundational for both of us. Something that we realized perhaps the best way forward is together. And so from there, I moved to the epilogue of where are we at now. We learned a lot from Lab2Market. That experience actually, I think, shaped a lot of both Yuta and I into being willing to try this entrepreneurship thing, to try to move it forward. And like I said, I'll be a bit more coy with where we are at now, but we've been building our startup for the last about year and a half since the Lab2Market program. We've developed that unique embolic polymer for the treatment of neurovascular disorders. We've evolved our technology significantly since then. What you start out with academia is never what you're going to end up with. So it's quite different, but still targeting the exact same pathologies and morphologies, still looking at the same treatments, and we're gearing up our manufacturing, hoping to be doing our first in human trials at the start of next year. So very, very quick timeline, and I'm not sleeping very much, but that's okay. So maybe that 80-hour thing is not untrue. And just, we've grown our team significantly since then. It started out with just Yuta and I and two other professor co-founders, and since then we've brought on a lot more people onto our team. This was most recently at a validation test we were doing out in Montreal. So we took a selfie, or an essay, at the airport. Thought it was kind of fun to include that. So that's my Lab2Market journey and where I came from and where I'm going. Thank you for listening, and it's Yuta and I, so we're still friends today, somehow. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and it was great chatting with all of you.